It was late on a Friday night, and I sat in my office, reviewing a list of candidates for a new opening. As the regional director for a chemical company focused on eco-friendly soil management products, my responsibilities were numerous. Our offerings helped farmers manage fertilizers and water retention, supporting the sustainability of food production. We took pride in being innovators in providing environmentally safe solutions in a field that often overlooked such priorities. Two of my office team members were about to leave, both due to their spouses' promotions, which required relocations out of state. As a result, they would need to resign in the coming months, so we were working quickly to find replacements. Our sales team covered 8 states across the Midwest, and this year we surpassed our goals, a major achievement for the company. Ruby, my executive assistant, peeked into my office to share the update I'd been expecting. Stanley, all 8 candidates have confirmed their interviews for Monday. I'm heading out for the night, she said with a quick wave as she exited. Every Thursday, I traveled to various states within my region to conduct sales meetings, which typically took up half the day. By Friday evening, I would be heading back home. My wife, Mallory, used these nights to catch up with her friends, though over the years our babysitting expenses had added up. These trips allowed me to meet with our sales reps face-to-face, helping them boost their performance and address any challenges. This investment paid off, as we hadn't experienced a single resignation in 8 years, quite a rare feat in this industry. I had just returned to the office in time to wrap up some last-minute tasks before heading home. The company had suggested that I delegate these sales trips to someone else, but I appreciated the quiet time they offered. Between Mallory, who always seemed to be up to date on everything, and our 3 kids, those peaceful hours on the road were a rare opportunity for reflection. Plus, managing the company's budget was a priority for me, and these trips helped avoid the expense of hiring a sales manager. Our eldest, Olivia, was preparing to graduate and attend university in the fall on a full scholarship, which was a significant financial relief. Our youngest, Sophie, was 16 and working toward her learner's permit. As a family, we were in a good place. Mallory and I had been married for 20 years, and she worked as the executive assistant to the district attorney. The DA had recently accepted a lucrative position with the federal government. Despite being close to my age, he had never settled down, and there were always rumors, though I never gave them much thought. For the past 15 years, my parents had kindly taken our kids every second weekend of the month, giving Mallory and me some much-needed time to reconnect. That gesture probably saved our marriage during some challenging periods. With Olivia set to intern at a senator's office in Washington this summer, that chapter was winding down, but it had made a significant difference over the years. Not long ago, my dad bought ancestry kits for all 3 of our kids, and with my approval we sent them off, curious about any distant relatives that might surface. Olivia thought it would be fun to keep the results a secret from her mom until they arrived, knowing it might take about 5 or 6 months. This weekend, Mallory had planned a trip to Memphis for a concert at the Orpheum, and we'd be back by Sunday. She always found ways to make our time together special. I met Mallory during my senior year of college, but our story wasn't exactly a fairy tale meeting. I was working as a vendor at one of our school's football games, selling snacks to the spectators. Mallory's dad was part of the team's medical staff, so she always had free tickets. That day she was with a date, and they got into a spat over something trivial. As she pushed him away, he stumbled into me, causing me and my tray of snacks to tumble down the concrete steps. The next thing I remember was waking up in a hospital bed, my head wrapped in bandages. The doctor told me I had needed 25 stitches across my forehead for a deep cut. Mallory visited me daily, overwhelmed with guilt throughout my week-long coma from internal injuries. She even met my whole family during that time. When I started to regain consciousness, I initially mistook her for an angel standing by my side. It took a moment to realize that it wasn't a vision of the afterlife, it was actually Mallory. Standing beside her was my then-girlfriend Lindsay. I remember feeling confused and, to be honest, a little disappointed to see her there. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I eventually woke up to find Lindsay gone and Mallory by my side. She stayed with me throughout my recovery, and our relationship slowly developed, even though we never made it official. 3 months later, we were married. I'll never forget how beautiful she looked walking down the aisle -5A, with long blonde hair, striking blue eyes, and a figure that turned heads. By the time we reached our 5th anniversary, though, things had taken a turn. We hit a rough patch and even considered splitting up for a while, but somehow we managed to stay together. One day, after leaving a well-known restaurant called Charlie's Bar and Grill, famous for throwing bread rolls across the room, we found ourselves having a deep conversation. The food wasn't particularly impressive, but the place reminded Mallory of her mother's cooking, so we made a stop there on our way home. Mallory brought up a topic that completely caught me off guard. She suggested the idea of infidelity, proposing that maybe I should consider having an affair. She talked about how traditional ideas of marriage were changing and how such an experience might help us understand each other better. I was shocked. To say the least, her suggestion didn't sit right with me at all. It seemed selfish and manipulative, like she was granting me permission to hurt someone else for our own gain. I couldn't hold back any longer and asked, "Why on earth would you want me to cheat? Did I do something so awful that you're hoping this will end our marriage?" The car descended into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Mallory was usually quick to respond, but this time she stayed quiet. After several minutes I turned the music back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. About an hour later, still driving and around 40 minutes from home, she turned off the music again and apologized, saying, "Stanley, I'm sorry. I think I've just been reading too many of those silly romance novels." I don't know what I was thinking. Then she turned the music back on, as if everything was normal. The problem was our kids and I all knew she despised those books. They had been her mother's guilty pleasure, but Mallory had always dismissed them as trashy and beneath her. Her explanation didn't add up at all. As we neared home, I realized there was one aspect of her life I had never really questioned: her Thursday nights out with friends. It had always seemed innocent enough. On the rare occasions I was home on Thursdays, she would skip her outing to stay with me. But after that strange conversation, I started to wonder if there was more to her Thursday nights. Was she going to bars with her friends? Was she involved in something suspicious? By the time we pulled into the driveway, I had resolved to find out the truth. Later that evening, after we settled in, I spent some time with my parents. They mentioned wanting to have a private conversation with me the following day, hinting that they were worried about Mallory and our youngest daughter, Sophie. Unsure of what they meant, I agreed to meet them around 3 p.m. After my morning interviews, the next morning I let Mallory know I'd be visiting my parents in the afternoon, telling her that dinner might be a little later. She seemed fine with that. When my parents arrived, we gathered in my office, and after some small talk, my dad got straight to the point. "Stanley, I deeply regret sending in those ancestry kits for the grandkids. We received a match. Sophie has a grandmother on her biological father's side who's been searching for her son and his descendants." He handed me a printout from Ancestry.com that showed a woman's name and phone number. My heart sank. From the look on my dad's face, I knew he understood the implications. "Dad, I don't think this is a mistake," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's find out more." I picked up the office phone, dialed the number, and put the call on speaker while starting a recording, wanting to ensure we had a record of whatever came next. After a few rings, a woman answered. "This is Stanley Spencer. I'm looking for Sylvia Tate about a DNA match through Ancestry.com. I explained. "You're speaking to her," she replied. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "Well, it's a bit complicated, but I've just learned that my youngest daughter, Sophie, is your granddaughter." "Are you talking about Sophie Spencer?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Yes," I confirmed. "Then perhaps you know my son, whom I had to give up for adoption when I was 15, Mrs. Tate continued. "I might if I knew his name," I responded. "He was adopted by a family with the last name Harper. His given name was Andrew," Mrs. Tate revealed. My heart dropped. My parents and I immediately recognized the name, and her words felt like a nightmare coming to life. "He's alive and well," I managed to say, still in shock. "He's the district attorney here in Butler County, and he's also my wife's boss." "Now it all makes sense," she said. "He's my only child," Mrs. Tate confessed. "I'm battling stage 4 lung cancer and don't have much time left. Could you allow Sophie to visit me before I pass away? I'll cover all the expenses. I just want to meet her and include her in my will." Given the circumstances, I'll have my parents handle the arrangements. I agreed. They'll coordinate her visit this weekend, but I couldn't permit Sophie to travel alone. "Is there anything else you need?" I asked. "Please provide a notarized statement for my lawyer to conduct a DNA test," Mrs. Tate requested. "He'll need to confirm her identity before amending my will, given the inheritance involved." "No problem," I assured her. I let my dad handle the specifics. I left the room and handed Ruby, my executive assistant, the voice recorder. Please transcribe and notarize both my conversation and the phone call. This is critical for the divorce proceedings. Should I also prepare the authorization for the DNA test, Ruby asked, clearly grasping the seriousness of the situation. Yes, but keep this under wraps for now, I replied. I need a few weeks to dig into my soon-to-be ex-wife's Thursday night activities. I then turned to my assistant, Mark. I need your and your wife's help with a personal issue, I said, making it clear how serious the matter had become. My wife, Sadi, is finishing up her shift for the day. I'll text her to come by right away, Mark responded, sensing the gravity of the situation. Back in my office, we worked out the logistics. Mark and Sadi would use the spare key they had for my house to pack some clothes for Sophie. The plan was for me to pull Sophie out of school next Friday and drop her off at their place by 10 a.m. After seeing my parents off, Sadi arrived, and I directed her to Mark's office, joining them soon after. Meanwhile, Ruby had already finished transcribing the documents and made the necessary copies. I handed copies of the conversation to Mark and Sadi. I handed Ruby the documents my father had provided, instructing her to make extra copies for the lawyer. Mark and Sadi, close friends of mine, were deeply shaken by the revelations about my wife's behavior. Sadi had known Mallory since they were neighbors growing up, and learning the truth left them both in disbelief. We brainstormed strategies to gather more information, and I proposed a plan. Mark would use my company car for his sales trips, while Sadi would take Mark's car, posing as if she was training for a new role. Meanwhile, I would discreetly follow Mallory on Thursday nights to collect evidence. My suspicions were mounting, especially after Mallory suggested I have an affair. I began to suspect she might be planning to run away with Andrew Harper, using the affair as grounds to seek a divorce. Sadi supported the plan and even recommended involving the police to gather detailed proof, mentioning a contact who could assist. Later, Ruby updated us that George Thompson had left the district attorney's office for private practice. Sadi suggested I pass along her regards when I met him. We devised a strategy to collect more information, and I headed out to see George. George, known for his work in the women's rights movement and for challenging significant legal precedents, was gaining a reputation for his unconventional methods in the legal field. As we talked, pieces started to fall into place. My marital issues with Mallory began around the same time she started working under Andrew Harper, which also coincided with my promotion and increased travel for work. If they had indeed been having an affair every Thursday, I had been blind to it for over 15 years. The expensive gifts Mallory received from Andrew now seemed far more suspicious. When I arrived, George was ready, having been briefed by Sadi. He handed me access codes to Andrew Harper's home and the alarm code, along with a phone number for a discreet team of professionals. George, who had grown up in tough neighborhoods, still maintained connections to handle things quietly. The access codes would be valid until the week's end, after which Andrew would be reminded to change them. George also proposed a plan to sue Andrew for child support dating back to Sophie's birth, which could potentially bankrupt him under state law. He recommended temporarily transferring guardianship of Sophie to my parents during the court process to prevent any claims of undue influence. When I offered to pay George in advance, he declined, warning that doing so might alert Mallory. Instead, he requested a check that could be cashed when the legal proceedings began. I left feeling confident that George had my best interests in mind. I completed the paperwork to transfer temporary guardianship of Sophie to my parents starting that Friday. They agreed it was the right move after George and I explained the situation in detail. Later, Sadi arrived in her 2002 Ford Taurus, as Mark had taken my car on his first sales trip. She left her car with me and drove Mark's home. My eldest, Olivia, texted to inform me that Mallory wouldn't be home for dinner. She was going out with her friends directly. When Sadi arrived, we switched cars and I packed my suitcase. Stanley, Sadi said, "The team is ready. Just tell me where to go, thanks," I replied. "George wants me to contact him when it's time so he can personally serve them." I couldn't help but wonder about George's personal dislike for Andrew. "He's all about doing what's right," Sadi explained. "Andrew has a reputation for not keeping his word." That evening I watched as Mallory and Andrew left their offices separately, meeting up for dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. Afterward, they parted ways briefly before meeting again at Andrew's home. I positioned myself where I could observe his house without being seen. Mallory arrived first, entering with the alarm code George had given me. Shortly after, Andrew pulled up, and they greeted each other with a passionate hug at the door. I stopped recording as they stepped inside. George's team had set up surveillance in 6 rooms of Andrew's house using audio and video equipment provided by a neighbor's son with connections. Everything was streamed live to a private page, giving us undeniable proof of their relationship. Around midnight, my daughter Olivia called, sounding upset. "Mom's not home, and she's not answering her phone," she said. I instructed her to call Andrew and demand that he put Mallory on the line. "Why would I do that?" Olivia asked, clearly puzzled. "Because he's been her Thursday night companion for over 16 years, I revealed, sharing a clip of Mallory's earlier interaction with the police. Olivia quickly came to terms with her mother's betrayal after seeing the video. I asked her to unlock the front door as I headed home to confront Mallory. Meanwhile, George called to let me know he had served both Mallory and Andrew with restraining orders, preventing them from approaching us. As I pulled into the driveway, Olivia opened the garage door so I could park Sadi's car inside. "Olivia," I said, "remember the locksmith who changed the locks?" It was all part of the plan, prompted by the DNA test results that revealed Sophie's biological link to Andrew Harper. Olivia was visibly shaken, and I held her close until she calmed down. We moved to the kitchen for privacy, where I played her the recording of my conversation with Mallory during our drive back from Memphis. It provided her with a first-hand understanding of her mother's deceitful behavior. "Why would Mum suggest you cheat?" Olivia asked, tears in her eyes. "To deflect attention from her own actions in case they ever came to light," I replied. It's ironic her suggestion led to everything being uncovered. Before we could continue, there was a knock on the door. A police officer stood outside, informing us that they had intercepted a taxi carrying Mallory. She had been warned about violating the restraining order and was made to turn back. That night, Olivia and I had a long conversation. She was devastated to learn that her mother had been unfaithful for more than 16 years. "How did we miss this for so long?" she asked, struggling to understand. I explained that it was easy to overlook, given how busy our lives had been raising young children, my frequent travel, and my complete trust in Mallory. Olivia nodded, realizing just how much her mother had taken advantage of our trust. I was stunned as Olivia pointed out the most hurtful part, that Mallory had exploited the trust we placed in her to carry on her affair. As Olivia went to make some coffee, I noticed the first light of dawn coming through the windows. At that moment, I received a text from Mallory, urgently asking to discuss something related to Olivia before I returned from my trip. As I considered how to reply, I reassured Olivia, then crafted my response to Mallory's message. I refused her attempt to manipulate me, telling her she was free to pursue her plans with Andrew Harper, but without our children. I explained to Olivia that her mother's suggestion that I have an affair was never about fixing our marriage. It was meant to use against me in divorce proceedings. Mallory had never anticipated getting caught after all these years. I could see how painful this revelation was for Olivia. Accepting harsh truths is often difficult, but people eventually come to terms with reality. I held my daughter as she cried again, and we managed to calm her down just as my other kids, Elliot and Sophie, woke up. I turned on the kitchen TV, intending to watch the morning news, and soon they joined us for breakfast. They were surprised to see me at home, but that quickly turned to shock when Mallory's face appeared on the screen. My son turned up the volume, and my heart broke as my children listened to their mother and Andrew ridiculing me, calling me clueless and naive. Mallory made a sarcastic comment that had both of them laughing. The reporter then cut in, noting that they probably weren't laughing anymore after their attempt to set me up with an escort backfired. The screen shifted to show George Thompson serving legal papers to both Mallory and Andrew, and as the reporter provided more details, my daughter Sophie burst into tears and ran over to sit on my lap. It was at that moment she learned, in a painful way, that Andrew, her biological father, was not her dad in the way she had thought, but her mother's longtime lover. Elliot summed it up perfectly, questioning what their mother's behavior toward me said about how she viewed the rest of them. Once Sophie calmed down, Olivia and I filled them in on everything that had happened since Mallory and I returned from Memphis. I arranged for them to be excused from school on Friday and Monday, so they would have time to process everything. Just as we were about to begin breakfast, Sophie interrupted, pointing out that the police chief was on the news. We turned up the volume again to hear the chief announce that both Mallory Spencer and Andrew Harper, our district attorney, were under criminal investigation. A special unit from outside the county had been assigned to lead the case. I reflected on how quickly private matters can turn into public scandals and how society rarely shows mercy when people like Mallory and Andrew are exposed. After breakfast, I asked the kids to gather around the table, showing each of them a copy of the letter my dad had received from the ancestry DNA match. Then I addressed Sophie. Your grandparents will be picking you up so you can meet your biological grandmother. She's very ill and has asked to see you. There's a significant reason for this meeting, but I believe it's best that she explains it herself. I added, but as far as I'm concerned, you are and always will be my daughter. If you have any questions, you can ask your grandparents. I then asked Olivia to help Sophie pack for the weekend while I called my parents. Once the girls left, Elliot turned to me and asked, "How are you holding up, Dad?" "I'm struggling," I admitted, "but I'm doing my best to stay strong." "Remember, son, if you ever find yourself in this position as a father, you have to remain strong for those who rely on you." With that, I called my parents to explain the situation. They assured me they would come over as soon as they finished packing their car, and they still had about an hour before they needed to leave for their flight. In that moment, something shifted in my relationship with Elliot for the better. We were more connected than ever. Together, we watched as Sophie, the daughter I had raised, left with my parents to meet her biological grandmother for the first time. I prayed that everything would go smoothly and that Sophie would continue to see me as her father when she came back. Meanwhile, at the district attorney's office, the atmosphere was tense. Mallory had gone out to buy new clothes after having her car towed and the tires replaced, while Andrew reviewed the lawsuit that George had served him. Although they didn't have a direct DNA sample, the evidence of the biological link to Sophie was indisputable, and Andrew couldn't deny it. The truth about their relationship and Andrew being Sophie's biological father had become widely known, turning into a political disaster for both of them. Under state law, fraud now included failing to disclose crucial information, and George used this to file a civil suit against both Mallory and Andrew. It was clear that they had deceived me for years. Despite many lawyers believing that George and I had a strong case, none were willing to get involved, likely because of George's formidable reputation in court. The exposure of their actions on social media, including their plan to ruin my life, had become a major news story, especially given my reputation in the community. Mallory, who had frequently shopped at a local clothing store for years, never expected to be confronted there. A woman accused her of being reckless, saying she should have seen the consequences coming. The woman was referring to the compromising photos of Mallory that had surfaced on Facebook. Later, when Mallory returned to Andrew's house, she noticed a company finishing up a service call. Assuming they thought she was the homeowner, they suggested resetting the security codes. It wasn't until later that she realized there had been no electronic signature verification. Mallory called Andrew, asking who might be trying to undermine his new role in St. Louis, and filled him in on what she had discovered. They both suspected that this situation went beyond my efforts to protect myself. Political motives seemed to be at play. As Mallory made herself a cup of coffee, she reviewed the divorce petition I had filed. It stung her to realize that her own words had made me suspicious. Her suggestion that I hurt others had given me the clues I needed. On top of that, the DNA match from Ancestry.com had uncovered the truth about Sophie's parentage, threatening to dismantle our family even before Sophie was born. She realized I had orchestrated the events of the previous night, exposing all the hidden secrets of her life. As she took another sip of coffee, the doorbell rang. When she answered, she found Mr. Harrison, the neighbor Andrew disliked, standing there. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted him. "What can I do for you?" Handing her a legal envelope, he explained. "Stanley used my place as a base for everything last night, and I was more than happy to help, especially after what Andrew Harper did to my son." He added, "The information in this envelope will be shared with the rest of your family." Stanley had asked me to find out if you were still finding humor at his expense, Mallory. She took the envelope back to the kitchen and opened it. Inside, she found damning evidence photos capturing her entering Andrew's home using her key, greeting him at the door, and engaging in intimate moments, all documented on film. The package also contained footage of her altercation with the police, along with a signed letter from me, outlining the potential public consequences that could devastate her future. The letter read that by the time I got back from Memphis, it was clear she was planning for our divorce. It continued, stating that I had spent countless days trying to comprehend how her affection for me had turned into such hostility. I realized she blamed me for what she perceived as the shortcomings in her life, especially during the years when we only had 2 kids. Feeling trapped in our relationship, she yearned for her carefree single life. That longing led her to another man, hoping to recapture the freedom she once enjoyed. I wrote that she had allowed Andrew to take her away from a life she despised, even if only for a few hours each week. She had stayed in our marriage not out of love for me, but because Andrew didn't want the responsibility of raising children, not even his own. She couldn't bring herself to leave the kids with someone she saw as worthless, so she remained, living a double life for years. Each time she and Andrew escaped the repercussions of their actions, her resentment toward me deepened. I asked, "How much did you two laugh at my expense? Did belittling me make Andrew love you more?" "What I cannot forgive," I continued, "is the message you and Andrew have sent to our children. It will shape their lives forever. I still don't fully understand how much enjoyment you both took in undermining me, using our children as mere pieces in your game." The letter closed with the words of a KVX news reporter, "Are you still laughing at Stanley Spencer? I described how I watched Olivia Elliott and Sophie here Mullery mock me on live television, breaking my heart." Our son, Elliott, summed it up perfectly when he asked, "If you see Dad as trash, what does that say about how you see the rest of us?" The letter ended with, "You've ensured that our children's relationship with you is virtually non-existent, but at least you and Andrew can enjoy labeling me a fool for the rest of your lives." Mallory's hands trembled so violently as she read the letter that she dropped the papers. She was consumed with resentment, showing no regard for me, our kids, or anyone else. Her actions revealed a selfishness driven by her own desires. Tears filled her eyes as she read on. I had a knack for pointing out people's flaws without outright condemning them, and my words had struck her deeply. It became clear that her actions were about preserving her lifestyle, not love. I also realized that Andrew had probably been urging her to leave me and the kids long before Sophie's birth, but his new job had accelerated their plans. By now, Mallory wasn't laughing anymore. She understood that I had exposed their behavior for what it truly was, and she would now have to face the consequences. It felt like a war declaration if Andrew Harper was going down. He intended to drag everyone along with him. Mallory continued to read through the divorce petition, and I could see how much it pained her. One of the lawsuits accused them of fraud for concealing Sophie's true paternity, and the potential financial fallout made her feel ill. If I won the case, both she and Andrew would face severe financial ruin. They had both underestimated me, assuming I was as naive as they had always thought. Saturday turned into chaos for my 2 oldest kids and me. From early morning until about 4 in the afternoon, family members streamed in. Mallory's parents, her 2 brothers, a sister, and their spouses all came by to offer support, each bringing a favorite dish to ensure we had plenty to eat. Even my own brother and sister drove in from out of town to check on us. Despite everything, we were surrounded by love and support. Each visitor struggled to grasp how Mallory could have hidden her betrayal for so long, and they all agreed that the evidence from social media was unmistakable. She had been trying to destroy me, driven by animosity. At one point, my father-in-law and I stepped out onto the back deck. He encouraged me to let go of whatever burden I was carrying, assuring me he'd keep others away until I was ready to rejoin them. He stayed with me until I regained my composure, mentioning that he planned to revise his will, intending to shift Mallory's share to my 3 children. He couldn't forgive her for what she had become. Later, I received a call from my dad, letting me know that Sophie had met with Mrs. Tate and that their meeting had gone well. Mrs. Tate had been gentle and understanding, helping Sophie open up about her feelings. The lawyer took the necessary blood sample and had a private conversation with my father. They discussed Andrew Harper, and my dad shared what we knew. It turned out that Andrew's biological father was serving a life sentence for a serious crime, and Sophie's presence had complicated matters regarding his inheritance. I assured my father that George Thompson had taken legal steps to keep Andrew away from us. That day was filled with visits from family on both sides, all offering their support. My parents were staying at Mrs. Tate's estate, where Sophie was spending the weekend. They were fond of Mrs. Tate and mentioned that seeing Sophie had brought a smile to her face after a long time. My mother spoke with Mrs. Tate, who expressed her gratitude for how we were handling the situation. Mrs. Tate planned to leave everything in a trust for Sophie, with me managing it until she turned 25. Before we ended the call, I asked my parents to text me when they were on their way back with Sophie so I could be there when she arrived. I also sent a message to Sophie, telling her that we all missed and loved her. Finally, we had a moment to tidy up the house before Mark and Sadie arrived with my car. I apologized to Sadie for not returning it sooner. She mentioned that the police chief saw an opportunity to take down Andrew Harper and was collaborating with George. George had even supplied some questionable evidence to aid the investigation. Mark mentioned that the atmosphere at the office was tense, with many people upset by the situation. He said some staff members had known about the affair for most of the week and were offering their support where they could. I reflected on how it had been an emotional whirlwind since Thursday night. The kids were still struggling at times, so I decided I'd take Monday off as well. Sadie asked if I had heard from Mallory, and I replied that I hadn't since Thursday night. I guessed she and Andrew were busy moving on with their lives, having made it clear how they saw us in public. Early Sunday morning, my youngest daughter called to ask if it would be okay for her and her grandparents to return late on Monday. I told her it was fine as long as her grandparents agreed. She thanked me for encouraging her to visit, sharing that Mrs. Tate had helped her understand that none of this was her fault. Her mother's affair had led to her birth, but before ending the call she told me she loved me. On Monday evening, Olivia, Elliot, and I waited as my parents pulled into the driveway, looking exhausted from the weekend. As soon as my mum stepped out of the car, she hurried into my arms, and I felt immense relief having my youngest daughter back home. My dad opened the trunk and carried in Sophie's suitcase, which Elliot took upstairs to her room. The three of them settled into the family room to catch up, with Sophie sharing stories about meeting her new grandmother. Meanwhile, my parents and I moved to the kitchen, where I brewed a fresh pot of coffee while they shared their impressions of Mrs. Sylvia Tate. She seemed at peace when we left, my dad said, adding that meeting Sophie had given her a sense of closure and acceptance of what lay ahead. My mum then took a legal-sized envelope from her purse and handed it to me, saying Mrs. Tate's lawyer gave this to me on her behalf. Inside I found a brief letter and a check for $50,000. The letter, concise and direct, expressed Mrs. Tate's gratitude for honoring her request. She noted that she had outlived expectations since our initial contact, acknowledged the DNA match, and commended me for how I had raised Sophie. She asked me to use the funds to support my family through the challenges we were facing and urged me to remain true to my principles. I let my parents read the letter, and we reflected together over coffee, realizing that we might have helped fulfill a dying woman's last wish. As we spoke, I updated them on everything that had transpired while they were away. I shared my belief that the worst of the emotional turmoil was behind us, and that we could begin returning to some sense of normalcy starting the next day. The rest of the week passed relatively smoothly, considering the circumstances. Mallory tried to reach out to each of our kids by phone, but they refused her attempts to reconnect. At the same time, the corporate office expressed satisfaction that I had finally stepped away from managing the sales meetings, and they began searching for a new sales manager, something they hadn't done in over 10 years. As I reviewed the monthly sales reports in my office, Ruby came in, looking troubled. When I asked what was wrong, she told me that my recent letter to Mallory had been published online in the opinion section of a regional Kansas newspaper. We quickly pulled up the website and found the letter. Ruby read it aloud, and I nodded, acknowledging that I had written it during a time of intense emotion. I wondered aloud if I might have been too harsh. Ruby shook her head firmly. "No, Stanley," she insisted. "The letter simply presents the truth about Mallory's actions. Either of them could have ended the affair and been honest, but they didn't. Andrew enjoyed all the perks without ever paying the price." We discussed how rare it is for people to witness the consequences of their actions in such a public manner. Having experienced her own divorce, Ruby remarked that the letter served as a reminder of the pain people endure before finding peace. She pointed out a comment from a longtime feminist on the website, highlighting how Mallory and Andrew's behavior had set back the cause of equality and empowerment. Later that night, Mallory and Andrew went out for dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. It was a busy Friday, but they were surprised to find the place unusually empty, with many unoccupied tables around them. When they asked the waitress about the quiet atmosphere, she explained that patrons were waiting but refusing to sit near them, likely a reaction to the letter I had written, now published online. Feeling uneasy, they quickly paid their bill and left. As they exited the restaurant, Mallory spotted her parents seated at a nearby table, waiting for their meal. She approached them with Andrew trailing behind, but her father, without turning to face her, said coldly, "Mr. Harper, I suggest you take your mistress and leave so my wife and I can enjoy our dinner in peace." Mallory left in tears, finally realizing that there was no way to undo what had been done. She would have to live with the consequences of her and Andrew's decisions for the rest of her life. Back at Andrew's house, they checked the newspaper website and saw the overwhelming negative response from the public. Their actions had drastically reduced their social circle. Meanwhile, I rode in the passenger seat of my car as Sophie drove us to Wichita, Kansas. We had received word that her grandmother Sylvia had passed away, and we were heading to the airport to board a private plane provided by her estate. Sophie was deeply affected, having grown close to her grandmother through their frequent phone conversations. Olivia and Elliot had been incredibly supportive, which brought us all closer together. They even started encouraging me to date again, but I remained cautious, wary of making the same mistakes. In the meantime, Andrew and Mallory had relocated to St. Louis. Andrew was allowed to start his new federal position early, as the county was eager to distance itself from him after reimbursing over $45,000 in questionable expenses. They moved into a small two-bedroom apartment, facing the reality of potential bankruptcy due to the civil fraud lawsuit. Under Missouri's bankruptcy laws, they were allowed to retain only $10,000 each in home equity. Our divorce had been finalized, and state law required Mallory to pay child support for our kids while they were still in school and to cover half of their living expenses if they chose to live on campus. The fraud trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. My kids continued to refuse any communication with their mother, and even her side of the family had distanced themselves from her. Mallory had learned the hard way that people's patience has its limits. Sophie had been required to attend a state-mandated meeting with her biological father, Andrew, but it didn't go well. In front of the child services representatives, she told him that both he and her mother were dead to her. We attended her grandmother's funeral, and after the service, the lawyer disclosed the significant inheritance left to Sophie. Feeling overwhelmed, we decided to sell her grandmother's home and most of its belongings, keeping only a few pieces of jewelry and some family photos Sophie wanted. When we returned home, with the school year nearing its end, I began preparing for the first day of the fraud trial, which was set for Wednesday. As I organized paperwork, Sophie came into the den. She asked if I could arrange a meeting with Andrew, Mallory, their lawyers, and George for Tuesday. She wanted them to fully grasp the consequences of their actions, inspired by an idea from her grandmother, Sylvia. I called George and set up the meeting. On a bright, sunny Tuesday, we all gathered for the meeting. Sophie, standing confidently, addressed Andrew, her biological father. She handed him a sealed envelope containing information about his own father's location in prison and a request for Andrew to visit him. Sophie revealed details about her conception and shared that her biological grandmother had left her over $1 million in a trust, which I would manage until she turned 25. That inheritance would have gone to Andrew if the truth hadn't come to light. She warned both Andrew and Mallory that if they didn't consider mediation before the trial, the legal consequences could escalate. As we left the meeting, I felt a deep sense of pride and humility. My daughter had spoken her truth, and whatever the future held, I knew that I had received a true blessing.